Hi everyone, this is Andrew Prima, Ukrainian American reporting from Kiev. In today's podcast, week 163 of Russian invasion of Ukraine, and this is the third week of April 2025. In today's podcast, latest updates from the front lines, and we're going to talk about how Putin agreed to Easter truce and why. Another week has gone by during which the Russians have carried out approximately 200 attacks daily, but only a small fraction of these assaults have resulted in any territorial gains. Northeastern Theater of Operations. There have been no major changes in the northern direction this week. The Russians are still attempting to push further into the Sumy region and bypass Ukrainian forces at the last stronghold of Free Kursk. But the necessary reserves have already been diverted to manage a minor Ukrainian breakthrough into the Belgorod region. Here, Russian propaganda asserts insignificant Ukrainian defeats in contradicted by reality. A video has surfaced, reportedly filmed in Belgorod, showing a group of Ukrainians driving by and chanting national slogans Glory to Ukraine and Glory to the heroes. In this regard, Ukraine's aim appeared to be to make the breakthrough to Sumy as expensive as possible. The Belgorod invasion is likely to near to the battles of the Kursk to be anticipated to advance into the rear of the enemy formation threatening Kharkiv. In the area of Kharkiv occupied by Russian troops, the fighting can still be described as reconnaissance operations by small units with limited heavy armor on either side. Although Ukraine frequently reports a potential expansion of this front, Moscow has not demonstrated that it has sufficient reserves to accomplish anything significant in this direction. Eastern direction of the fighting. So fighting continues to rage on the Kupiansk front, with Russian troops struggling to expand their bridgehead across the Oskil River and facing limited effective transport support, although they are clearly still trying to build bridges. The Kremlin war of the past year has increasingly demonstrated my often repeated thesis that lacking even one element in the combined arms warfare dramatically reduces effectiveness. Tanks and artillery are far from obsolete. It is precisely the continuous degradation of the Russians' capabilities in these two military areas that makes attempts to use Soviet methods unsuccessful beyond the tactical level. So, in other words, when the Russians strike, it quickly fizzles out. Just a year ago, Ukrainian soldiers on the front line had to fend off wave after wave of armored vehicles, sometimes dozens in a day. Now, this occurs less and less frequently. As a result, Ukrainian troops are likely able to rest more often. This further enhances their effectiveness. The Russian approach to warfare relies on delivering a significant volume of firepower to a target area to incapacitate the enemy's capacity to resist. Western military thinking, influenced by postmodern intellectual misunderstandings, is overly focused on attempting to get inside the enemy's head, neglecting the fact that everything begins with firepower. If you cannot physically sever the enemy's communications and logistics, it doesn't matter how quickly you finish your observation, orientation, decision, etc. The Russian military accurately grasped the significance of firepower in its doctrine. The enemy's will to resist must be shattered, not coerced into submission through deception. Therefore, although the Russians can obviously regain some ground, they are losing so many soldiers in mass attacks primarily aimed at merely distracting Ukrainian forces and stalling them elsewhere The tactical victories do not translate into an operational breakthrough that would pose a serious threat to Kiev. Offensive operations are not gaining the needed momentum. Ukrainian units repel attacks of any scale using firepower, and the invaders' attempts to alternate waves of infantry with massive armored assaults do not result in a systematic breach of Ukrainian defenses. Thus, despite the gradual expansion of the bridgehead on Oskol and Zheribevka villages, Putin's forces are still far from causing a serious crisis for Ukraine. Some progress has been noted in the area of bridgehead on Oskol, and it seems the enemy hopes to make it substantial enough to be challenging to eliminate. However, Ukrainian forces holding positions east of Oskol in front of Kupiansk are in a strong position to launch a counterattack into enemy's rear in the area southeast of Dvorichная. Another complication for the enemy is the aggressive stance of the 3rd Assault Brigade of Ukraine, which has now become the core of the 3rd Assault Corps and poses a huge threat to the enemy with the new Ukrainian counteroffensive that could rapidly change the situation in Kupiansk. Although the 3rd Assault Brigade has not made significant advances in the past week, the lack of Russian occupiers reserve in this area might render Svatova a viable target for an attack. Disrupting the road from Svatova to Kupiansk could further jeopardize the Russians' bridgehead through Oskol, as the flank of the Ukrainian counterattack would be better secured. However, recently, Moscow has been clearly demonstrating its desire to break through to Liman via Zherebets. This would represent a significant step toward the collapse of the northern flank of the front Russian surrounding Seversk. Only at the northern edge of the arch, on the approaches to Liman, are there signs of Ukrainian vulnerability that the enemy could seek to exploit. The bridgehead behind Zherebets has expanded rapidly, given the current situation. It appears that the adversary has found either a weakling, a less trained brigade, or a gap between the positions of the armed forces of Ukraine that can be targeted. Since the 21st Separate Mechanized Brigade, primarily trained and occupied by Sweden, had been defending the approaches to Terni for an extended period, it has now been transferred to the Kursk region. As a result, Ukrainian forces have been compelled to retreat behind Zheribets. It wouldn't be surprised if the 21st rappers in the area, based on the information coming in, the Ukrainian forces here are significantly outnumbered. The offensive on Liman could shift direction and turn into an attempt to encircle the 3rd Assault Brigade, which is defending Borova. However, Moscow's prospects near Siversk now appear stronger as far as that is possible. For over 2 years, a relatively small Ukrainian group has been successfully holding back the Russians' persistent attempt to break through to Siversk from three directions. With little fanfare, they maintain control of a dense forest area, a quarry zone, and a stretch of steppe, critical regions that Moscow need to seize to penetrate the urban areas of Donbass under Ukrainian control. In truth, this sector should have collapsed a long time ago. The fact that Moscow continues to send in insufficient troops, mainly in unsuccessful attempts to do so, reveals much about how Moscow is managing the conflict overall. The logic that the Russians seems to be following is that Ukraine must be held back in all directions. The problem is that it is Moscow that is currently feeling the shortage of forces in most areas along the front. The Ukrainians are generally taking a wait and see approach, effectively repelling attacks and sweeping offensive maneuvers from the battlefield. The fact that Ukraine frequently disrupts Russian offensives with preemptive strikes shows that initiative generally remains with Ukraine. Siversk is one of those areas where the sudden collapse of the Ukrainian brigade could dramatically alter the operational situation, yet there are no indications of such a development in the near future. However, sooner or later, the enemy will be compelled to make a serious attempt to attack. Otherwise, the flanks of any assault on Slavyansk and Kramatorsk will remain dangerously exposed. At the same time, one should never underestimate what the Ukrainians can achieve in such situation. So, the situation around Konstantinivka village is expected to worsen, and in this context, Ukraine's shift to classic elastic defense rather than a less flexible zonal defense appears to be a well-founded decision. According to available data, the enemy is finally making gains in the central part of Toretsk, most of which it had previously lost due to Ukrainian counterattacks, and is preparing to attempt a bypass of Chasiv Yar from the south. However, visible movements remain limited. Moscow has also started clearing the Ukrainian salient west of Terezk. This area must fall for Konstantinivka to be captured. The advance is slow, despite the relatively small number of Ukrainian forces in the region. The Ukrainians are apparently making effective use of the fortification systems they constructed last year. Back then, such an offensive would have seemed much more sensible. Attempts to capture Pokrovsk and break through Vuglidar, Kurakhova, and Velika Novoselka have led to significant losses for the Russians. Ukraine has lost some territory, but in return, it has inflicted heavy casualties on the enemy in this area. Chasiv Yar and Terezk have never fallen, contrary to the expectations of many. A frontal assault on Ukrainian positions in Donbass has proven to be a failed strategy from the very start. Even if the front line shifts just a few kilometers, it doesn't resolve the fundamental issue. Ukraine remains capable of supplying its forces in nearly all regions. The only feasible option was to encircle the Donbass, but all the invaders' attempts in this regard have failed. As for Pokrovsk, the situation here has hardly changed since last week, despite another wave of Russian attacks. The offensive continues, but without significant outcomes. Ukraine has been conducting counterattacks for the past month, yet now it finds itself under pressure. However, according to reports, the Ukrainian troops are still carrying out the operation to reduce the salient along the Solona, which Ukraine is systematically dismantling. If Moscow ramps up the pressure, the defense perimeter around Pokrovsk will likely narrow slightly. However, the Russians currently have no means to entirely encircle the city, making its capture highly unlikely. Let's talk about southern direction of the fighting. If the ongoing fighting between Orekhova and Kamenka marks a significant Zaporizhia offensive, as some Ukrainian sources have warned for about 6 months, then Putin's forces once again failed to grasp even the basics. So far, several weeks of intensified conflict have led to forces to advance in a few kilometers into the gray zone. This is not the most strategic location to position enemy forces, even if the aim is to divert the attention of the Ukrainian leadership. At this stage of the war, that seems unlikely since the Ukrainian command of frontline troops remain decentralized. A similar situation can be seen in the Kherson region. The enemy remains consistently active on some level, fighting for control of the islands in the delta, which hold no operational significance. Nothing the Russians are doing in Kherson poses a threat to full scale crossing, and the enemy will not be able to maintain the bridgehead for long. As a result, they terrorize the civilian population with drone attacks and attempt to tie up as many Ukrainian troops as possible. The threat level is so low that the Ukrainian Kherson direction is defended only by small forces, mainly Coast Guard brigades under the command of the Marine Corps. Meanwhile, Crimea is effectively worn down by strikes from naval drones targeting air defense systems. The more they succeed in undermining the enemy's defenses, the easier it will be for drones to access the critical targets for Moscow. So let's talk about the recent Easter truce. So why did the Kremlin needed that? Putin just recently announced the so-called Easter truce. He did so unilaterally, yet he called on Ukraine to reciprocate. Naturally, this is not taken seriously in Ukraine, but for whom and for what purpose was it intended? The simplest explanation is a basic propaganda campaign. Putin already did this at Christmas in 2023. However, this goes beyond mere propaganda. The situation is much more serious. In the West, and even among some commentators in Russia, there was an immediate connection made between Putin's decision and the threat posed by the US Secretary of State Marco Rubio and later Trump himself that the US would withdraw from the negotiation process without progress in the peace talks. And this is indeed the case. Putin doesn't want Trump to get tired and quit the negotiations process. Therefore, he is once again offering Trump a facade of his readiness for a ceasefire. They say, "You wanted a ceasefire by April 20, I'll give it to you." This is symbolic gift to Trump before the symbolic date, 3 months into Trump's presidency. Everything is clearly calculated. Putin continues to stroke the ego of Trump while simultaneously demonstrating that Kremlin is supposedly ready for a ceasefire. At the same time, this subtly trolls the US position on Putin's part. The US and Ukraine proposed a ceasefire for 30 days, while the Russian dictator suggests a truce for only 30 hours. This presents a new creative move by the Kremlin after the phased ceasefire. Putin continues to lead the goat regarding his readiness to peace for peace negotiations. However, the main goal of this peacemaking action is different to frame Ukraine and present to Trump the notion that Putin wants peace while Zelensky opposes it. This is why the so-called truce was announced at 4:45 p.m., set to commence at 6 p.m. Simultaneously, Kiev was urged to do the same. Essentially, the ceasefire was expected to begin a little over an hour later. It's clear that Kiev needed to assess the situation and formulate a response. If they agreed to a ceasefire, they would issue the appropriate orders. Obviously, an instant reaction was improbable, let alone immediate consent to Putin's actions. It is also unlikely that hostilities could be halted within an hour if they had already begun by that time. This outcome seems to have been deliberately calculated. I'm not implying that both conflicting parties must prearrange a genuine ceasefire and agree to its date and time. The Kremlin likely anticipated that if hostilities continued after 6 p.m., particularly from the Ukrainian side, Ukraine would be blamed for violating this truce. What is significant is that when announcing the so called truce, Putin warned that the Russian troops must be ready for a possible violation of the Easter truce by Kiev, and stressed that Kiev has violated the moratorium on strikes on energy facilities more than 100 times. In other words, Putin announced the alleged violations of the Easter truce by Ukraine in advance. Some commentators in the West and even in Russia have pointed out that the entire spectacle of the Eastern truce is intended for one audience: Donald Trump. I would add that some other people around Trump seems to have been aware of the exact timing of this spectacle. In other words, they clearly knew what was going on. For instance, US Vice President J.D. Vance announced on Friday, April 18, that even in the last 24 hours, we believe we have some interesting things to report. This is where the danger emerges. Some individuals in Trump's circle may misinterpret Putin's deceptive maneuvers regarding the supposed truce as a genuine desire for peace, while simultaneously blaming Ukraine for supposedly violating the truce. That's why, under the current negotiations conditions, Ukraine couldn't simply dismiss this Putin's spectacle. We couldn't just agree to Putin's term, but at the same time, we had to respond constructively. Once again, for the same Washington spectator, and to once more thwart Putin's insidious schemes. President Volodymyr Zelensky said if Russia is now suddenly prepared for genuinely adopt a stance of complete and unconditional silence, Ukraine will respond in kind, reflecting what is done on the Russian side. Silence will meet silence, and strikes will be answered with strikes. Should complete silence truly take hold, Ukraine proposed to extend it beyond the Easter period past April 20th. This will reveal Russia's true intentions, since 30 hours is sufficient for headlines, but not for genuine confidence building measures. 30 days can provide peace a chance. Simultaneously, the Russian side ceasefire violations were highlighted. The main counterproposal from Ukraine is to extend the ceasefire beyond April 20th. This disrupts Putin's plan while also aligning with expectations of the American side. We know only one thing: Putin cannot be trusted. Thank you for listening. If you like my podcast, share it with your friends.